Welcome to the Radical Intimacies podcast series by Memefest. I'm Oliver Vodeb, a sociologist looking closely at design and communication, co-founder of Memefest, and editor and curator of the Radical Intimacies, Designing Non-Extractive Relationalities book. In this podcast, I will be in conversation with the authors who contributed to the book, many of whom I've known for years as collaborators and friends. The book was published in 2023 by independent academic publisher Intellect. The book explores resistance to capitalist domination through design, focusing on dialogue, power, land, interventions, and radical praxis. It presents the concept of radical intimacies, a relational way of designing that fosters closeness and decolonizes knowledge and the public sphere. In this series, we'll dive into these ideas, discussing and expanding them, and creating spaces for deep, meaningful exchange in the undercurrents. Let's see what happens. Hello world, hello from Melbourne, and welcome to our 5th episode in our Memefest Radical Intimacies podcast series. This time I have the immense pleasure that I had a dialogue with Eric Jackson from Baltimore. Eric has contributed an amazing chapter to our book Radical Intimacies, which is titled Black Land and Food Sovereignty Praxis, Humanizing and Restoring Intimacies between Land, Food, Culture and Black People. I met Eric in 2019 for the first time in Baltimore, USA, when Memefest collaborated with Black Guild Institute. Eric is a Black community leader, founder and servant director of Black Guild Institute, which is a Pan-African organization working on Black liberation. We have been collaborating for several weeks on an amazing project together with Goucher College that has invited us. And Memefest has mobilized its networks and people from around the world. From the core team came to work with Black Guild Institute in developing strategies, communication media, design tools. We work together with local students and academics, members of the community, and of course the Black Guild Institute. From that on, a immediate friendship grew. Something that happens very rarely, and Eric and I and we have collaborated, Memefest and Black Guild Institute, further on also on a large project in Saigon in 2022. But back to this conversation. So our conversation touches on the key points of the fight against food apartheid. It is a conversation that I believe is very inspiring, as Eric is a highly inspiring and articulated speaker. Just a few more words on Eric. He's an organizer, educator, and filmmaker, serving as the visionary and a co-founder of Black Guild Institute in Baltimore. He is acting as what they call the servant director of Black Guild Institute, which is, as I said, a Pan-African institution committed to building a movement toward Black land food sovereignty. Eric is a Baltimore native from the Cherry Hill community, and Eric is affirmed and secured in this work through the love of his family and community. I'm warmly inviting you to listen to our podcast. Please enjoy. Are you in the mood to talk about food apartheid and intimacy?
I'm always in the mood to talk about that. I talk about it in my sleep.
Yeah, great. So I think that what would be great for our listeners, for them to understand at the start of our conversation what is food apartheid, and coming from you rather from me. Can you tell us a bit? I mean, we will talk about this all along. our conversation, but for the start, can you tell us a bit, what is food apartheid, how you see food apartheid?
Sure, yeah. So food apartheid, the way that I talk about it, well, I give kind of historical context, right?
Yeah.
Listeners might be, familiar with the apartheid regime in South Africa because that's where the word comes from.
Yes.
However, it is unfortunately a tactic that fascist, governments use in general to really separate people from resources and all of the things that are important to our livelihoods and our existence, our cultures, and so forth, and lead us to be dependent on the dominant narratives and dominant, cultural underpinnings.
Yes.
And so, food apartheid is no different in that even coming from the Afrikaans word apartheid,
Yeah.
that means apartness. It's about food apartheid is about the systematic um, disconnection and disempowering of people through the separation of them and us from our from food, from land, from each other,
Yeah.
from our cultural practices around food, and I think broadly, it is the result of it is the symptoms that we see, like disease and social uh, separation from each other and isolation. And it, as far as I'm concerned, it is what makes intimacy difficult, right? Closeness or connection
Yes.
difficult. And so I know we'll talk more about it, but that is food apartheid. It is the fundamental destruction of access to power, resources, land, and
Yeah.
food for the people.
So it steps in between, it separates.
Yeah.
When I was preparing for our collaboration back in the day, and you would be familiar that I was doing a lot of work on food, and I used the term food democracy and food sovereignty. All these concepts were familiar to me, but food apartheid was something I learned through you and through your organization. I'm interested a bit more about the term, for how long was it used, like in the USA or, within your own practice, like I understand through your explanation now, where the roots of the term are and, what it means, but, was it an established term? And how did you get to use this term?
Yeah, it's a movement term. People often misunderstand it to be an academic term.
Yeah.
But many academics here who do work in disciplines like anthropology and sociology
Yeah.
and food systems work have successfully co-opted them. And then there are still others who are scholar activists who use it. But it's a movement term that is credited. Or I would say coined by, or at least credited to Karen Washington in New York City,
Yeah.
who was a farmer who used that term publicly in in forums, in print news, and I would say sometime around the early to mid part of the first decade of the 21st century. So
Yeah.
somewhere around 2008, 2012 is when the term began to be coined and
Yeah.
or used broadly. And Black Youth Institute started using this term probably like really early on. We started our organizing in 2012
Yeah.
and really developed the institution, the name, and all of the outward facing work between late 2015 and early 2016.
Yeah.
And roughly around that time is when we started to use that language and kind of amplifying it.
Yeah. So So I think it has to be said. I mean, the way I understand it, the term is closely related to black liberation, right? So food apartheid
For
does
sure.
have to, it's at the center of when you say movement, right? That would be black liberation movements, right? Am I right?
That is correct. Yeah, it's an impediment to liberation.
Yeah,
If you can't control, and if you don't control the
yeah,
food economies that house us, that feed us and so forth, then it is directly an impediment to um, liberation.
yeah, and it seems it's very relevant to your city, right? To Baltimore.
Yeah.
When we were working together, I learned, about how Baltimore was planned, the urbanism, the urban design, the intentional
Hmm.
segregation,
Yes.
of black people. So I'm interested to, for us to learn a bit more in this context about Baltimore, because it's a specific environment in which you work, and in which you are working, against food apartheid. Can you please give us a bit of context in terms of Baltimore?
Yes. Yeah. So Baltimore, for the listeners, my local dialect, and accent. I say Baltimore.
Yeah,
You'll hear Baltimore in other ways too. It's the same place.
yeah,
Don't be deceived.
yeah,
But yeah, Baltimore is a port city,
yeah,
and why that's important in the context of thinking about food and labor and spatiality, intimacy, relationships is that along with cities like New Orleans and New York City, they have harbors, and this is where um, the heart of industrialization
yeah,
happened in the United States of America, to include Chicago and Detroit, other places that have these waterways.
yeah,
Baltimore is different than the other cities that we talked about because of its formation and because of its relationship to what scholars have shared in the past, the Mason-Dixon line, right? It is one of the most the northernmost um, southern city, if you will.
yeah,
And so it's this thing where if folks understand about the nuances of the United States of America, the history of the South is rooted in institutional enslavement of Africans, that and with pervasive stealing of black labor and black wealth,
yes,
and the North being very different. And so Baltimore being kind of central to both, it's not quite a northern city,
yeah,
but it also isn't a deep southern city.
yeah,
And so the major industry in Baltimore, um, around industrialization, 1800s, and even a little before that, is the production of steel,
yeah,
um, and um, again, thinking about black liberation and all of these things, we have to center at least part of the analysis on black captivity as well, and the savagery that it took to create that. The kind of this brought up the creation of just like canning industry in the city of Baltimore,
right,
um, and other industries around, like importing and exporting goods that use steel.
yeah,
That was like huge in Baltimore City and other cities as well in the U.S. And during deindustrialization, right, where the economy changes in this country, what you find is, obviously, I'm skipping through a lot of history. Where you have the post enslavement of Africans in this country,
yeah,
there is Reconstruction, and then there's industrialization, and then there's deindustrialization. And at this time, this is where Black people are. There are no more steel mills for Black people to operate in, to work in, because the cheap labor that these companies exploited, Black families. It was the vehicle for Black families to really move to the middle class
Yeah.
in this urban context. However, once the steel industry declined and then completely flatlined at the end of the 20th century, you find families having to figure out what to do next, and so all through this time, um, housing segregation, right, and this phenomena that scholars have called as redlining, really formed and perfected in the city of Baltimore, and that is another form of apartheid, really, but more so around housing and the arrangement of people and real estate for the purpose of essentially creating um, racial enclaves. And so that creates the pretext for the work that we do around food apartheid, because again, it's rooted in this, in uh, imperialism and these ideas of white supremacy.
Yeah.
And so it's like, listen, we can preclude people from advancement socially, from the resources necessary to do so,
Yeah.
and people are going to have to push against that. And so our work and the work of many other freedom fighters in the modern day
Yeah.
are built upon people's resistance,
Yeah.
but then also the pretext for this kind of these social phenomena um, that really relegated people as having less than and
Yeah.
working to have more.
Yeah. So how, like, I understand the context, and I see this, of course, as as a trajectory of long, historic exploitation of black people, and of course the,
Yes.
the capitalist domination, which, in my view, is inseparable to food apartheid. And
For sure.
and what is to me so inspiring is to learn about the movements, and the organization that you work with, that you started, and you were a servant director of Black Yield Institute, is one part of a larger movement. How strong, or how alive are black liberation movements in Baltimore, and also connected with food apartheid, like, if someone thinks about Baltimore, what is the resistance? How can we think about that? How
Sure.
lively is that?
Yeah. So, in Baltimore, because of the pretext that we're talking about, we're talking about a state and then a city
Yeah.
that had the state being Maryland
Yeah.
and the city being Baltimore, where black people are subjugated, right?
Yeah.
And that's anywhere around this world, and not just for black people. People are subjugated. There's going to be resistance.
Yeah.
And there's a rich tradition. And again, I think that there is a sister locally here who talks about the relationship between, I mentioned earlier, New Orleans,
Yes.
which is also in the South, New Orleans, Louisiana, as another, what she calls sister city,
Yeah.
because it's similar in that it's in the South and that it's a port city, and enslaved Africans came through these ports. And
Yeah.
I give this as a pretext because, again, resistance was strong. I have to say this really quickly because I don't know where your listeners start.
Of course. Yeah.
There are narratives that are shared about African American and just generally broadly African people's resistance struggles, that they look a particular way, and there are so much media that would suggest that people would just okay with oppression, you know what I'm saying, of all terms.
Yeah.
Where there is oppression, African peoples have resisted on the continent of Africa and throughout the so-called uh, middle passage, if you will. And so, as far as I'm concerned, that just needs to be something that's stated. And
Yeah.
so, because Baltimore has had oppression, there's been so much resilience, resistance, and revolution that has happened.
Yeah.
And so, in the current context, you have people who are working in areas around education
Yeah.
and addressing community-based blight that has resulted in the disinvestment in communities, right? And the impacts of the redlining that I kind of shared already.
Yeah.
There are people who are working on reparations legislation
Yeah.
to ensure that in the United States, there is a term, the war on drugs
Yes.
that started. It kind of started in the kind of mid to late 70s and then really had an uptake during the Reagan years in the
Yes.
1980s, and which, uh, resulted largely in the separation. Here
Yeah.
we go with that theme of separation, right?
Yeah.
Of largely Black men
Yeah.
from their families due to petty marijuana,
Yeah.
offenses, or even other illicit drugs or what have you.
Yes.
And people are working to essentially mitigate the effects of the war on drug by working to have legislation that issues funding
Yeah.
to go to organizations that are working to address some of the direct and indirect results of the war on drugs.
Yes.
There are other efforts to, as we're talking, right, to really build power and help people to establish control within their food economies.
Yes.
There are people working on rights for reproduction and for you know facilities, for like proper facilities, modern facilities for students to have, to have proper education. So
Yes.
there's a bunch of political activity in Baltimore that I think, being um, a person who's been privileged to travel the world and see different things,
Yeah.
that is pretty unique. It's not by itself,
Yes.
because there's so much resistance around this world, and that I appreciate, and people not willing to just stand for it. But I would also say Baltimore is definitely a place that is rich in this, and I grew up in a community, in a
Yes.
neighborhood that has a history of resistance, resilience, and revolution since its inception in the mid 1940s.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, and that's everything from the so-called civil rights struggle of the 1950s and 1960s to the Black Power movement, and even now, people working to ensure that families have a high quality of life,
Yeah.
and that these organizers are doing everything that they can at any intersection that you can consider that impacts lives in general, and
Yes.
in this case, particularly Black lives. You can be
Yes.
thinking about employment, education, food,
Yeah.
violence, whatever it is. There are people in that community and in the city that are organizing to not only address it at a legislative level,
Yeah.
but also getting people involved and excited about the work so that we get our just due.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. Like, you were talking about the war on drugs, and
Yeah.
to me this really makes sense. That the oppressive strategies are using substances as drugs together with food, right? So it's not a coincidence, right? It's like a very sophisticated strategy, right? In order to instill this separation that you're talking about, right? So it's food, and then there's drugs, right? And there's a relationship between them. So I always wonder, what is it that is so significant about drugs and food, in their relationship, and that it's so fundamental to our human existence, right? That
Yeah.
these two things are being used, as a weapon.
Yeah.
Like it's in some way a colonization of pleasure. It is this tactic where people are being deprived of any means to create a decent livelihood, and to maintain this prohibition of drugs in order, right, to have all this dynamic that then feeds into into this tool and strategy to oppress people. What do you, how do you see this as you know, what is how can we think about food and drug being so fundamental to our existence that this is being used against us?
Yeah, I think one, thank you for that. I mean, there have been a few um, books that have been written over maybe the last decade or so, within the last decade, that have really pointed to empirical evidence to suggest that the state, you know what I'm saying? The state has sponsored these, the saturation of illicit drugs
Yes.
in urban content, urban centers specifically.
Yes.
It got out of hand in the last few years around like prescription drugs,
Yes.
and it's always been an issue, but it was more so a kind of a you know, white, middle class, and upper class kind of problem because they could access it. Now
Yeah.
everybody's got access to these prescription drugs,
Yes.
but that is like the current iteration.
Yeah.
What you find with drugs itself, with like illicit drugs, the Schedule ones, twos, and threes in this country, and that's everything that you can imagine,
Yeah.
that not only is there participation, but like you were saying earlier, there is a psychological component.
Yeah.
And it's insidious, really, right? If you live in an oppressed, human beings have been dealing with this, or at least it's well documented. Let me say this:
Yeah.
since feudalism, right?
Yeah.
Before capitalism even existed,
Yeah.
human beings experience oppression and they find ways of dealing with it.
Yes.
Now, Frantz Fanon and Wretched of the Earth talks about this, right?
Yeah.
Some people will go to, drugs and alcohol and other things. Other people go to, resistance and, political organization. Other people go to religion or whatever. We have our different ways of
Yes.
dealing with the issues. And so instead of addressing oppression, what ends up happening is that these law and order politicians historically have then blamed the victim.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying? Or blame the people for, like you said,
Yeah.
seeking pleasure, right?
Yeah.
Because pleasure seeking is a human reality and a
Yeah.
human right.
Yeah.
What is not a human right is the oppression of, of the larger populace, right?
Yes.
And so, for me, I think that is really the thing that, and it's not that that's not a part of the political discourse. I think that it is important to insert it here as we're talking, and in the same way, talking about food,
Yeah.
which is, obviously there are elements of pleasure there,
Yeah.
and even at the basic, before even that,
Yeah.
we just have to eat. So the thing is, if you can either infiltrate the food system with I'm just going to say, for the sake of it, quote unquote, food
Yeah.
that is unhealthy.
Yeah.
And I say quote unquote because it's not always food. We call snack foods
Of course.
food.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
However, we're not trained to understand that dandelion or some other local, North American wildflower is
Yeah.
good as medicine, right?
That's
That's
right.
not considered food. That's
Yeah.
considered nasty or whatever.
Yeah.
But anyway, the thing is, if you can infiltrate that and you can centralize through corporate food businesses,
Yeah.
The corporate food regime, make these foods available, make them cheap,
Yeah.
and work with retailers,
Yeah.
multinational retailers, to get it to the people at cheap prices.
Yeah.
Then you can not only extract wealth from the people,
Yeah.
you can also create a psychological dependence
Yeah.
on the way that food is grown, distributed,
Yeah.
and made available,
Yeah.
which completely skews how people engage with food,
Yeah.
how they engage with farmers, how they engage with their neighbors, so
Yeah.
forth and so on.
Yeah.
So on the other side, so if you put those two together, and I'm trying to be short, I'm sorry. But the thing is, if you the best way to have people who capitulate with the oppressive regime
Yeah.
is to keep them hungry,
Yeah.
satisfied yet hungry, right? Like
Yes.
nutritionally deficient.
Yes.
Then they can't really fight back,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And they don't have a reason to fight back
Yeah.
if they're like, well, my needs are being met, right? You know, I have what I need. I'm comfortable,
Yeah.
right? And then um, you know, for all intents and purposes, keep a little bit of kind of law and order and say, hey, we're not going to tolerate this, yet still infiltrate communities with illicit drugs.
Yeah.
Then you can have people who are disillusioned
Yeah.
and hungry and who are not ready to fight,
Yes.
who are not ready to push back, who are pacified
Yeah.
and lullabied. And this is the work that our movements, you know, are working on, to be connected to people in the day-to-day activities, right?
Yeah.
We talk about intimacy. The question is, where are our people? If they're on the front porch of their homes, on their stoop,
Yeah.
then that's where we need to be. If they're listening to podcasts, that's where we need to be. If they're reading, we need to be writing.
Yes.
If they're listening to music, we need to have an album, right?
Yes.
Using these ways to connect with people and not asking folks to jump over hurdles around where we want to be.
Yeah.
And we do obviously want to create the next world, the next economy, and so forth.
Yeah.
However, we got to start where we are.
Yeah.
And not demonizing people for it, recognizing it, helping people become politically astute and understanding the political process, and,
Yeah.
and having analyses so that we can move from where we are to where we want to be. But
Yeah.
that's not going to come immediately. So we got to be where people are. And that's what we do,
Yeah.
you know, every day.
Yeah. I think, you know, it's so obvious in this example that dependence addiction is used as a tool and a strategy to create oppression, and that capitalism actually largely, you know, runs on creating addictive behavior, you know, dependence. And in that sense, you know, I think implicitly to what you said, you know, to perhaps comment a little bit on what I was able to observe when we were collaborating in one part of Baltimore, namely Cherry Hill, you know, the one area. The food that's available there isn't food, as you said, right? But it's called food, and it is. It's not a coincidence that this fast food, or you know, the substances are designed to create addictions. You know, so we have still this interplay of drugs. So what are called illegal drugs. Then you said, you know, fentanyl, for example, which is legal.
Yeah.
Then you have other legal substances which are named food, but it's not food. It's, you know, it's engineered sugar mostly. All of this is hyper dependent, but also, as you said, it has this psychological effects. It destroys people's attention. You know, it has a direct impact on our cognition. It deprives us of health, and that is so obvious. And it's interesting that, you know, capitalism doesn't back off of making profit. Obviously, you know, so it does make profit while creating oppression, and oppression is a way to create. Oppression is the way to create profit, right?
Absolutely. And one of the most important pieces to really unearth in talking about this is that it is normalized. And that's what makes it difficult to begin, you know, to unpack that with people, because then when we're talking about, you know, kind of alternative ways of looking at things and kind of moving away from the delusion dance, that I've learned from one of my elders. He uses that language of like the delusion dance, right? The people are deluded because the illusion, they're smoke and mirrors, right? And so we get caught up with it. It becomes so normal, and it's normalized through satiating people with convenience and affordability, and then also taxing people through, the cost, cost prohibitive access to certain foods or whatever. And so, like you said, I mean, capitalism not only doesn't back off, it creates those, you mentioned like artificial, kind of bioengineered foods,
Yeah.
but it's also just like it's socially it's bioengineered, it's manufactured. Now people feel like we have these needs and that we have to meet these needs.
Yes.
And so that's what makes it easy, right? You lock
Yes.
in somebody, and then if you lock them in, you lock in a family, then you at least have two generations, right?
Yeah.
And they have to just keep doing their job.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Making it cheaper, making it faster, making it, putting it in front of people
Of
through,
course. Yeah.
various
Yeah.
mediums of information. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it is a complex and dynamic issue that has to be understood in nuance, because our liberation is going to happen in nuance. It can't happen in broad
Yes.
strokes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So for our listeners, to take this a bit further, and speak about Baltimore and Cherry Hill in this instance. So on one hand, people are giving these options, and they're being normalized, and people are made dependent, so people have a craving, a desire for them. On the other hand, this is only possible because of deprivation. So the way
Yes.
the way the urban texture is designed, from my observation, is that there is then, on the other hand, also a lack of any healthy options, right, of food.
Yeah.
And there is, to introduce for our listeners the term food deserts, right? So
Yes.
basically meaning there's a distance to healthy food, so people just can't reach it, and it's physically distant. I think you said it's more than a mile away to any decent opportunity to buy fresh and healthy food. And
Yes.
I also remember, it's not only that, it's also you either have to drive there, or because you can't really walk, or it's difficult to walk because there's highways that you would need to cross,
Sure.
and all that. So it's like really structurally made impossible. And then there's also a lack of knowledge, right? A lack of knowledge of healthy food, a lack of knowledge of how to prepare and cook, good food. So all of this, kind of works together. And I'd like to go more into the organization, that you started, for our listeners to understand more what it is. So Black Yield Institute.
Yes.
Can you please tell us more about Black Yield Institute?
Yes. So, Black Yield Institute is we've been around. We're celebrating 10 years this year.
Amazing. Yeah.
Of the institution itself. Our organizing started a few, organizing and doing this work for about 13 years or so.
Yeah.
And we started at that time and continue today with the basic premise that community control and autonomy is possible.
Yeah.
Right? We have to, one, understand it and explain it, like I said, in a nuanced way.
Yeah.
Right? That and to create solutions that that are just as dynamic, right? Our solutions have to have that level of dynamism.
Yeah.
Because we're dealing with these multi-layered issues, as we've kind of explained to this point.
Yeah.
And so with that being said, our approach currently, and I like to say for the listeners that we are a power building movement institution that happens to do food and land work.
Yeah.
Right. And that's an important distinction to make, because we're not a farm.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? A
Yes.
farm is a tool.
Of
you know
course.
what I'm saying?
Of course.
And our food supply chain work are tools
Yeah.
for modeling what's possible. And so on one part of our work, we do have some supply chain work that includes the production of food.
Yeah.
And the manufacturing of value-added products.
Yeah.
um, as well as aggregating food and distributing food and retail with Black Yield Marketplace. So between Black Yield Farm and Black Yield Marketplace, these two initiatives are, like I said, modeling what it could look like for Black people to really be at the helm of decision making for what foods getting into particular communities. And so right now we're working in South and Southwest Baltimore doing those works.
Yes.
And then equally important, again, remembering the theme of dynamism, it's not just enough to kind of do the immediate work of introducing certain foods and procuring food from Black farmers to keep a circular economy in play or to activate it. And that's important, but it's not enough. The
Yeah.
other piece has to be really taking on thought leadership and building community through political education
Yeah.
and expansive learning experiences. And then also, I mean, for the lack of a better way of saying it, to learn together while we build together so that as we're fighting the good fight,
Yeah.
that we center relationships at the same time that we're centering understanding of historical context, the contemporary context, and what movements are doing around the world.
Yes.
And all of that is really important. And learning skills, right? Organizing skills, not just having theoretical knowledge,
Yes.
but having that. And then finally, we provide these movement support services that we call them. We recognize that we've learned a lot through the an effort that wasn't as successful as we wanted it to be in establishing a community-based food co-op.
Yeah.
And all of the things that we've done, we recognize that we have a lot of information that we can offer to our comrades who are trying to do this work, doing this work, and support, recognizing that whole adage of, we are only as strong as our weakest link. But if our weakest links are strong, then we're strong together, right?
Yes.
And so between those two spheres of our work, we feel that at least is encompassing of really creating what we call this nebula, right?
You're right.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. This nebula, this movement nebula, right? That brings on new ideas, that connects people.
Yeah.
That also provides food and so forth.
Yeah.
And so that's where we are today.
Yes.
As the political climate is changing, as social and cultural dynamics are changing, and the economy in general in the United States are changing,
Yeah.
and in Baltimore, as a result, we stand firm on the reality that our tactics might change. For today,
Yep.
that's what we're doing. Modeling what we can do on land with each other.
Yes.
And getting ourselves tooled up to be able to administer our own liberation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's amazing. When we were working together in Baltimore, when we did the Memefest event, the collaboration with Black Yield Institute and Goucher College. And there was so many profound moments, like for example, visiting the garden, and having the discussions there, and feeling what's going on there. And I completely saw from the start, that you choose, to use food and everything's related to it as a tactic, as a strategy, as a tool.
Yeah.
That is so necessary and also so effectful. It's important for me perhaps to talk a bit more about what we've done there together in our collaboration. So our small contribution was well, first of all, we came to learn, and we were wishing to collaborate, and that worked incredibly amazing. Speaking from a more than 20 years of experience of Memefest, working with different groups, that was just mind blowing how we were able to connect, immediately found a dialogue and a kind of common, purpose and vision.
Yes.
So, you know, our small contribution was to in collaboration, also, you know, with students and people from the Memefest network and of course, you know, the people from Black Guild Institute to work together on design, on strategy, on communication, and on media, right? So we
Yes.
developed all these different strategies and tools and artifacts, basically, right, of different
Yep.
kinds, you know, that you were able to use. And I would like to ask you, please, you know, if you can give us a bit of an idea, you know, how that kind of work that Memphis does, you know, in your experience and in your view, can be of use for such movements, you know, and what did you do
Yeah.
with what the outcomes were at our sessions after we then left, and you know, and you kept on doing your own work.
Yeah. So I'll just say, man, I really do. And I mean, I've shared as we've talked over the years how much I appreciate the um, kind of embedded connectedness
Yeah,
that our respective organizations like already had. So it was just an easy when we met, on Goucher's campus. It was just like the people, there was a connection, the organizations, there was a connection. So
yeah,
knew that there was this, level of like high potential and and I'll like I said, I'll get to the tools and how we're
yeah,
using them. And I really just want to start there because I think that that's important.
yeah,
I assert that movements, right, are the building blocks for them are relationships.
yes,
That is also the building block of all life.
yeah,
There's no one person, one being in the universe that exists, independent of itself. You know what I'm saying?
yeah,
And so, starting from that space, just recognizing that we one appreciate that and that there's connection, and then, quite frankly, one of the things that we're very clear about, even as an organization that is amplifying, leading, and organizing toward, or contributing to the trajectory of Black liberation and praxis, and Black radical tradition.
yeah,
We are, and I frame it that way because people often think that we just mean, even though our locus, our kind of the scope of our work and the focus and the apple of our eye are African peoples. That's not the same thing as we don't work with nobody else. People often misconstrue that.
yeah,
And we recognize that. And so I start that by saying, or I start there because I want to say that what I really appreciate is that, you brought together, along with others, people from around the world who
yeah,
could bring skills
yeah,
that, somehow, possibly their social mobility related to their race allowed them to have, and
yeah,
they distributed that knowledge to other people and then support what we do,
yeah,
right? So students on the ground,
yeah,
the community connected to Black Youth Institute and so forth.
yeah,
And I think that that's special, and I think that's important for listeners to know and understand.
yeah,
And in terms of like what we did together, it was exciting. I mean, some of the stuff you already kind of named directly. We one of my favorite things, and I'll end on this one, is talking about the exhibition
yeah,
and our final, like kind of, the public exhibition and then kind of the private one
yeah,
between, Black Youth Institute community and the Memefest community and Goucher representatives as well.
yeah.
But also, I mean, there were things like one of my favorites, the sandwich wrap.
That's right.
We're
Yeah,
still, we've used the sandwich wraps for events to
yeah,
kind of use it as propaganda
yeah,
about food apartheid, Black land and food sovereignty as terms and concepts, what they mean, what our organization is doing,
yeah,
pamphlets and stencils, and some other things that have been helpful for us to, again, advance the propaganda, the necessary propaganda, for our work that draws people in,
yes,
and so uh, that was really helpful. Oh yeah, and let me back up too. Website and some memes
yeah,
that help to kind of make some of this stuff so that can be heady if people haven't heard it before,
Yeah.
make it more palatable, and that's a really important piece. And so I think that that was the real value add of the deliverables, if you will, that we
Yeah.
came up with.
Yeah.
Um, that was really helpful. And it's not that that's not important, because it is extremely important to me.
Yeah.
However, the piece that I really, really appreciate is the relationship.
Yes.
The relationships that were developed as a result of these workshops that the students were a part of, and how some of them stayed connected to our organization.
Yeah. 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 Thank you.
How
Yeah.
our relationship transformed and what have you. And I think, yeah, Ian,
Yeah, thank you, Eric. It's very, very heartening, to hear that, and to know that our little contribution was of use. For us, it was very transformative. It was very empowering, and we had a lot of discussions in our group, and everyone felt that, and we still have, conversations about that experience, and it has impacted
yep,
Memefest fundamentally. And in the chapter that you wrote for the Radical Intimacies book, at the very start, you said something which I really like, is that you said that we created magic, when we met, fairly
yeah,
early. And I think, like, to me, I agree with you completely. It's the relationships are what matters. What is the fundament, what is the backbone. And it's obvious, like, we all, after all these years, not only we became friends and brothers, but we kept on collaborating. We have an intellectual exchange, and we will keep on collaborating, because of
for
the
sure.
type of relationship. And I want to to speak about intimacy. I think, in terms of movement building, and all of the work that you're doing, and we are doing with Memefest, is difficult. We operate from a position of
Yes.
resistance and oppression, and little resources and all of that. And for us at Memefest, it's the friendship that keeps us going, right? So there would be no Memefest if the core people wouldn't be friends and brothers, and the
Yes, sir.
fact that this happened between our groups, and you and I, that's just amazing. I just really want to say that. And
Yes, sir.
I also, to speak a little bit, to change a little bit the focus. As much as I'm aware that you use food as a strategy, and you said, well, that's at the moment, and we might change our strategies in the future. Uh, I want to say and make it clear that you do this, in my view, in a highly profound manner, right? Like, philosophically,
Thank you.
spiritually, theoretically, practically, right? So it's like highly profound, what you're doing. And there is a term, perhaps, that I'd like to talk a bit more about. Maybe also because I live in Australia, and I've been doing, and we as Memefest have been doing a lot of work with Australian Indigenous Aboriginal groups, and I learned about country, what this means, and land, what this means. So you're talking about black land and food sovereignty, right? So
Yes.
the term black land, and food sovereignty. What can you please tell us more about that? Why black land and food sovereignty? What does that mean?
Yeah. So that, that's a movement term, right?
Yeah.
It is representative of a necessary political, um, ideological, economic, social, and spiritual effort to become more in control of the food economies that we live in our own communities, right? To be
Yes.
self-determined. In fact, it is, I'm saying it in different terms, much more, political terms, but it's the same thing that's made of the so-called American dream, right? To
Yeah.
be able to say, I want a thing, and to create it.
Yeah.
And that is around the world. And so for us, we recognize that that doesn't come without struggle. And so, when we talk about sovereignty, we're talking about greater control and autonomy about what exists in our communities, right? And
Yeah.
built on those legacies that we talked about before, we recognize that if we are going to be healthy,
Yeah.
We recognize if we are going to have relationships with farmers, we have to do it,
Yeah.
right? The corporate food regime will not facilitate that.
Yeah.
We have to. And um, so for us, it's also rooted in this reality that, as I've kind of talked about, but I'll zero in on it again,
Yeah.
Black people um, before and now still bear the brunt of um, or carries this country on its back. And so therefore it carries the city on its back, right? The whole idea is that, um, and I've gotten into conversation with indigenous organizers and scholars here about, how can you claim sovereignty for land that kind of, almost like that is a result of settler colonialism.
Yeah.
But in that framing of settler and colonial, settler and the settled, we're neither. You know what I'm saying? African
Yes.
peoples are neither. We were unfortunately considered as property,
Yeah.
as tools.
Yes.
And so, at some level, there's got to be some restitution for the hundreds of years of active enslavement of Africans and the exploitation of labor, and then the years after legal enslavement, the exploitation and stolen wealth, and stolen land and other power resources from Black families and Black institutions. And so I still believe that even in the 21st century, that one of the best resources that you can have to demonstrate power is land.
Yeah.
Is, in a capitalist system, it is the means of production.
Yeah.
And so it's all about really being able to decide for yourself what you want and to provide, as Dr. Amos Wilson, an American scholar who's passed on, talks
Yeah.
about it, as he talks about this concept um, essentially power is, or one enacts power when you can provide for the social needs and desires of a people.
Yeah.
And right now, Black people cannot do that.
Yeah.
In order to do that, we have to have land. We have to have property.
Yeah.
We must produce our own knowledge and
Yeah.
our own networks in order to do that.
Yeah.
And the pursuit of Black land and food sovereignty is the mechanism that we are lifting up as a way to actually administer, our liberation.
Yeah. Like to go a bit more specific in some of the strategies. I mean, you mentioned so much already. But looking at what you wrote, in the book, you use the term praxis and sovereignty praxis, Black land and food sovereignty praxis, for example. And you mentioned education, and I know you're working on something which is called the Sankara Hammer Academy, right? If I spelled this correctly.
Yes.
Right. So
Yes.
So like I'm interested, to learn more about how how we can together, think about praxis. So obviously, the very basic idea of that is it's some sort of a reflection, that happens, upon our actions in the world, right? But
Yes.
but we can only reflect with what we have, right? So I'm only able to reflect with my knowledge and experiences and with who I am, right? But
Yes.
the praxis is a term that is familiar. It is widely used. It has its political, I think, connotations, because it's powerful. And there's no revolution, no movement, without knowledge, without theory, But then again, only the thinking or writing and theorizing and so on, has to be linked with the action, with the action in the world. So how does this operate in your view in practice for Black Guild Institute or for yourself? Like, what is praxis? How do you employ it? How do you maintain it, in your organization? How do you nurture it?
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of it is, I mentioned the work that we are doing, right? And so you have the work, right? And so it's the, sourcing food from folks, for example, right?
Yeah.
If I'm spotlighting the marketplace,
Yeah.
and our Black Hill Marketplace provides food, culturally appropriate foods at an affordable rate to people who come to the market.
Yeah.
And we're working to convert those into cooperatives.
Yeah.
And so we'll continue to, make these offerings and create space to expand political education and social programs within the market so that we bring people together, right? To utilize it as a social food hub, right?
Yeah.
A way for people to get their food, but
Yeah.
then also get their, social needs met. And
Yes.
so that is, the the way that we politicize and activate people within the physical location that we have.
Yeah.
Now, the thinking about that, right? So that's the action part. The thinking about that is, I mentioned it earlier, we have to go where our people are.
Yeah.
And we have this saying that we started using, peaches, not speeches, right?
Yeah.
If we can actually get people to buy some of the best peaches that are sourced locally, that's amazing. People are like, wow, I would buy those. Then we can easily have people then take the next step to come to a meeting to really plan our efforts toward autonomy, right? And
Yeah.
we've done this in the physical location.
Yeah.
So the forethought is that we meet the basic needs and utilize that as a way to organize our people. Not unlike the Black Panther Party and the Universal Negro Improvement Association,
Yeah.
that institutions that operated in the 20th century.
Yeah.
And the reflection piece, like how do we nurture that? We continue to be in communication about what is working, what's not working, to be we talk with the people who we're looking to continue to to organize and,
Yeah.
and at best serve if they're not interested in taking the next step
Yeah.
to become politicized
Yeah.
and activated.
Yeah.
And we keep political education and general assessment and evaluation or what have you of our efforts
Yeah.
as central to what we do.
Yes.
Right. And so that's how we encourage it. And and I have to say this, I think it's important. We do food work, but in order to do it, you got to have people who do accounting and you got to
Yes.
have people who do administrative stuff.
Yes.
Everybody in our organization, no matter who they are, how they interface with the organization as a board member,
Yeah.
as a staff member, as a volunteer, as a collaborator,
Yeah.
they are in essence committing to continued practice of political education.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
If you are punching numbers and making sure that our organization is has the fiduciary responsibility,
Yeah.
and we're spending well and all of that, you still have to be grounded in political theory, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that is kind of how we're encouraging it. And outside of that, what we were talking about earlier, that the baseline of what we do is about relationships.
Yes.
And centering what it means to actually be a liberated human being doing liberated work, because
Yeah.
you can't divorce one from the other.
Yes.
And so that's how we encourage the praxis. And
Yes.
it doesn't always work, right? It's an uphill battle.
Of
We
course.
still live in a society where you can have a job where you don't have to be so on, if you will, all the time. And
Yeah.
it's like you can just do monotonous labor and it's okay.
Yeah.
That's not what we do here. We
Yes.
are building people.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? As well as building the world that we want to see.
Yes. So there is to me a very challenging part in what you're explaining. Like you said, your actions need to be grounded in political theory, right? So, of course, you as Eric and the community leader, you're incredibly well read, educated, sophisticated. So for you to engage with political theory, it's not difficult, right? It's work, it's engagement, but you can do that, right? But not everyone can, right? Not everyone can. So how is this translation happening, right? So, you know, you have people who can engage directly with readings, with abstract thought, with
Sure,
theory, philosophy, and so on, but then other people not in that same sense,
sure.
right? So how is this translation happening, you know, towards these people through your education and your reflection? How do you make these translations?
Yeah, so one, thank you for that because it gives me an opportunity to say two things.
Yeah,
One is more so pretext for what I said before, and the other is answering this direct question. Now, the pretext piece, when I say theory, I don't always mean, in fact, I don't even mostly mean what comes from the academy,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
When I think theory, I'm talking about how people understand the world,
yeah,
what people's what indigenous knowledge exists already, right?
yeah,
And so being able to really sit with that
yeah,
and monumentalizing that act,
yeah,
right? Of like being clear about why you're doing what you're doing and what you believe, and utilizing experiential, pedagogical and andragogical frameworks
yeah,
to facilitate that.
yeah,
And it doesn't need to be highly scholarly for us to do that. It just
yeah,
needs to be material, right? Material in that it shapes our actions.
yeah,
It shapes the way that we understand the world, and it's examining that. That's number one. And then number two, to answer your question, when it does need translation, this is where we're doing the political education. It's not just like I'm standing in front of people or somebody standing in front of people with a 3 hour lecture.
yeah,
It happens through a regular conversation at the table
yeah,
or over a game of cards,
yeah,
playing cards or whatever. It's happening during a festival or something like that in context where, like I said, where people are. And there's not a whole bunch of translation that has to happen necessarily,
yeah,
except that there is sometimes translation. And then other times it's just really, I don't know what's the best way to say it, but like a move or pivot in how we understand a thing that we might have experienced our whole lives,
yeah,
and kind of understanding what's happening behind the veil, if you will.
yeah,
That's what a lot of our work is. It's like, listen, I know that you've experienced, for example, one phenomenon here in Baltimore and in just the United States,
yeah,
that a big kind of a byproduct of the foreign policy of this country is that, you know, with unfortunately, immigration trends really follow where the United States continue its expansion, right?
yeah,
Some people wouldn't call it colonialism. I would. It's just corporate colonialism, right?
yeah,
So that happens, right? And the United States goes to a place, and then it gives, kind of, there are certain kinds of people that they're looking for that can immigrate to the country. And then there's certain jobs and industries that folks are relegated to, at least for the first and sometimes second generation.
yeah,
And one of the phenomena that show up because of the kind of jobs that are readily available for people largely from these days East Africa and across Asia
yeah,
are like corner stores, or what in some places are called bodegas,
yes,
coming from the Spanish language. So
yeah,
that idea, we end up like experiencing people who have English as a second language, culturally do not, didn't grow up American, and then have like these adverse social experiences that people are kind of, they often kind of blame so-called, immigrants, or what I like to call the corner store class, right?
yeah,
Of like, people say, well, man, they don't respect us and so forth and so on. But in their analysis, what they don't know is, because they don't know this, is that the United States of America's foreign policy and preferential treatment in
yeah,
small business administration
yeah,
actually funnels people into these jobs. And so the United States of America are facilitating these social issues between the people who are running liquor stores and who are running corner stores and who are running these fast food carry out restaurants
Yeah.
that are, often we have this analysis that people are extracting wealth from our community. And it's not that it's not true. It's
Yeah.
just that they are advancing what the United States is actually facilitating.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And so it's like in that, obviously I just did that in like 3 minutes.
Yeah.
It's helping people understand, like, hey, listen, your enemy isn't the shopkeeper.
That's right.
You have to understand that the shopkeeper is actually doing what they can do to survive,
Yeah.
because they were going, they were seeking asylum.
Yeah.
And it gives opportunities to understand, oppression in other places. And so when I say theory, that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about. And I think, and it's less like laden in fancy highfalutin words and concepts,
Yes.
and abstractions,
Yeah.
and more about how we understand the world around us so that we
Yes.
can act appropriately.
Yeah.
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 Perhaps for some closing thoughts, like to go back to the concept that we together were developing, thinking, as radical intimacies. To me, it's this, closeness to the world, which basically ends up in, or ends up in relationalities which are in opposition to the extractive strategies of, capitalism,
Yeah.
colonization, food apartheid. And you wrote so beautifully about, the work being about humanizing, humanizing what's being dehumanized. And I find this, a very fitting and beautiful way to think about, radical intimacies. They're radical because we are, we're separated. We are being forced to be
Yes.
separated, from the world.
Yes.
And by, and because we have to react and fight against that in creating a relationality to the world that is, going against the dehumanizing strategies, this is then what becomes this radical intimacy.
Yeah.
And so in terms of culture, food, land, and people, this is what you were writing about, in your chapter.
Yeah.
In my view, we have developed, a concept that's strong and that sits in practice. And, I would like to keep thinking about that, keep trying to understand, how to nurture a practice of radical intimacies, so that, I'm very much looking forward, for us to keep our collaboration, to keep our friendship,
Yes, sir.
I can't wait to do more.
Yes, sir. We will. As far as as long as we have life in our in our bodies, and,
Yes.
and a zeal to liberate ourselves and the people who we love and the people who we are in the world with.
Yes.
We'll have more work to do, my brother.
Yes.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you, my brother. It was such a pleasure to talk to you, and we will reconnect very soon. I wish you. I know it's very late for you in Baltimore, so I wish you a good evening. And thank you so much. It's amazing that we could talk like this.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Enjoy your day, and thank you.
Thank you. See you soon. Bye. Thank you for listening. This podcast is a production of Memefest and Intellect, publisher of Original Thinking. It is a celebration of our collaboration and Intellect's 40th anniversary. The podcast is produced in Naarm, also known by its colonial name Melbourne. We would like to pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Sovereignty was never ceded. The music at the start and end of each episode is by the band Bait from Boona in Victoria, with members Michael McGuinness and Malachi Doyle. You can find them on Bandcamp. Check them out. Thanks. Until our next episode, take care.